Hello, all you cool cats and kittens. It's Miss Smith here with two common errors that I noticed that you made in your memoirs. Now, for those of you who finished your memoir and submitted them on time, I sent you an email with a video with feedback specifically for you on your essay. However, I'm going to give you a little lesson here about how to create tension and start your memoir in an interesting way. So if you already had an amazing memoir, which some of you did, you can still benefit from this lesson by pushing your memoir to the next level with an interesting beginning and by creating a sense of greater tension in your story. I am going to be using examples during this lesson from a book that I just finished reading over our little break called The Joy Luck Club, which I absolutely adored. It is not a memoir, it is a novel, so it is a made-up story, but the author, Amy Tan, does an amazing job of these two things, starting out the little stories within this book and creating tension in each smaller story. So we're going to be using this novel as an example of these two things that I'm going to be showing you today. Here we see the beginning of one of the vignettes or short stories in this book. I'm going to read it first and then tell you what I'm noticing about how the author began this short story. I once sacrificed my life to keep my parents' promise. This means nothing to you because to you promises mean nothing. A daughter can promise to come to dinner, but if she has a headache, if she has a traffic jam, if she wants to watch a favorite movie on TV, she no longer has a promise. I watched this same movie when you did not come. The American soldier promises to come back and marry the girl. She is crying with a genuine feeling, and he says, "Promise, promise, honey, sweetheart, my promise is as good as gold." Then he pushes her onto the bed, but he doesn't come back. His gold is like yours. It is only 14 carats. To Chinese people, 14 carats isn't real gold. Feel my bracelets. They must be 24 carats, pure inside and out. It's too late to change you, but I'm telling you this because I worry about your baby. I worry that someday she will say, "Thank you, grandmother, for the gold bracelet. I'll never forget you." But later she will forget her promise. She will forget she had a grandmother. Here are some amazing things about the beginning of this memoir. We see, or not memoir, but the beginning of this short story. We see that immediately she's getting our attention by using this phrase here. I once sacrificed my life. We've got this high stakes beginning that is punchy. It's a very short sentence that immediately has us wondering, how did she sacrifice her life and why was it just to keep a promise? It just immediately gets me interested and is pretty high stakes. Next, she sets up characterization in this first sentence. I get a sense of who she is as a person from that one sentence. If she's willing to sacrifice her life for her to keep her parents' promise, then I can guess what's valuable to her. That first sentence also sets up the situation that she's going to be creating throughout this short story. She's going to tell us the story about the promise that her parents made and what she did to keep that promise, even though it meant giving up everything that she knew and loved. All in that one sentence, we can get that situation. The next thing we see that this author uses to begin the short story is the use of you. Now, unfortunately, no one that used the word you in class had a successful use of it. For those of you who decided to use the word you switched back and forth a lot between talking to somebody and talking about them, which didn't work for you. However, in this story, it does really set up the stakes, the reason for the story. We're going to hear this story about how this woman sacrificed her life to keep her parents' promise because she wants to tell her daughter. She's afraid that if her daughter doesn't keep promises in the future, she's going to forget her family or her daughter will forget the family. So she's saying about what the importance of promises are and why she's telling her daughter this story. So that's why the use of you is being used here. It's giving the reader an idea of why we're hearing about this. Other things we can learn from this beginning is that she's Chinese, which is an important part of this book. She's got some pride and purity. Although she's just talking about gold here, we can also tell from her character that she really prides herself on getting the things that are genuine, maybe even being a genuine person who is pure inside and out. We can tell that family is important to her, not only because of the first sentence, but because she immediately goes to the fear that her granddaughter will forget her. And all that we can take just from this first paragraph, or first part of this story. What we do not see here is, hello, I am Lindo Zhang. This is the story about how I sacrificed my life to keep my family's honor. So one day, my family, there was a flood and they had to give me up so they could live somewhere else. She doesn't give everything away at once. Instead, I'm getting a sense of her personality, the situation, and what's valuable to her that's going to be important to this story, without giving it all away in just the first couple sentences. Here we have another example of a short story that is within the Joy Luck Club. Here's how it begins. I was 6 when my mother taught me the art of invisible strength. It was a strategy for winning arguments, respect from others, and eventually, though neither of us knew it at the time, chess games. Bite back your tongue, scolded my mother when I cried loudly, yanking our hand toward the store that sold bags of salted plums. At home, she said, wise guy, he not go against wind. In Chinese, we say, come from south, blow with wind, poom. North will follow. Strongest wind cannot be seen. The next week, I bit back my tongue as we entered the store with the forbidden candies. When my mother finished her shopping, she quietly plucked a small bag of plums from the rack and put it on the counter with the rest of the items. Again, this short story starts off with a really punchy first sentence that gives us an idea about the character that we're hearing from, what she values, and what this story is going to be about. It's memorable, it's to the point, it's unique. Now, just because we've seen now 2 of these in a row, that does not mean that that's how you need to start your memoir, but this is another great beginning. Then we have another great explanation here that leads into not only the short story here, but the rest of the chapter, which is a story about how she became a chess master, and then she eventually quit the game because of a silent battle that she had with her mother. So we get all of that kind of preview in just this one sentence right here, which is another great transition into this part and the story. Then we have dialogue. The author could have just started with this great beginning. Bite back your tongue, scolded my mother when I cried loudly, yanking her hand toward the store that sold bags of salted plums. That by itself would have been a great beginning to the story. So she could have started here, but this bit of dialogue also hints at the story ahead and gives us some great characterization. We see a lesson learned in these first 3 paragraphs of this chapter, a theme that we're going to see throughout the chapter, which is that, again, the strongest winds cannot be seen. Other things that we get from this memoir beginning, we understand that both she and her mother are from China. We see a relationship between her mother and her. We learn that she listens to her mother's wisdom, that her mother doesn't respond to people who make their requests loudly or are very verbally communicative. We see the values that these 2 people have, this value of quiet strength. They value wisdom and listening. So we see all that just in the first 3 paragraphs. Again, without this starting, hello, my name is, this is going to be a story about, or it was a bright sunny day and my mom and I went shopping. Here is a stronger way to begin a story. Finally, I've got one here that's a little bit longer, but I specifically chose this one because it's got a long thought process from one of the characters, and a lot of you included a thought process somewhere in your memoir. I had a lot of comments about that. Some of you were giving me just kind of a quick idea of your thinking, or you just said I really thought about that moment without giving me your inner dialogue. And this is a great example of inner dialogue. When I was little, my mother told me my great-grandfather had sentenced a beggar to die in the worst possible way, and that later the dead man came back and killed my great-grandfather. Either that or he died of influenza 1 week later. I used to play out the beggar's last moments over and over again in my head. In my mind, I saw the executioner strip off the man's shirt and lead him into the open yard. "This traitor," read the executioner, "is sentenced to die the death of 1,000 cuts." But before he could even raise the sharp sword to whittle his life away, they found the beggar's mind had already broken into 1,000 pieces. A few days later, my great-grandfather looked up from his books and saw the same man looking like a smashed vase, hastily put back together. "As the sword was cutting me down," said the ghost, "I thought this was the worst I would ever have to endure, but I was wrong. The worst is on the other side." And the dead man embraced my great-grandfather with the jagged pieces of his arm and pulled him through the wall to show him what he meant. I asked my mother how he really died. She said, "In bed, very quickly, after being sick for only 2 days." No, I mean the other man. How was he killed? Did they slice off his skin first? Did they use a cleaver to chop up his bones? Did he scream and feel all 1,000 cuts? Why do you Americans have only these morbid thoughts in your mind?" cried my mother in Chinese. "That man has been dead for almost 70 years. What does it matter how he died?" I always thought it mattered, to know what is the worst possible thing that can happen to you, to know how you can avoid it, to not be drawn by the magic of the unspeakable. Because even as a young child, I could sense the unspoken terrors that surrounded our house, the ones that chased my mother until she hid in a secret dark corner of her mind. And still they found her. I watched over the years as they devoured her piece by piece until she disappeared and became a ghost. Now, this short story starts off with a bit of humor because of the contrast that we have in this beginning. Starts out with this long sentence about a horrible death, or he died of flu 1 week later. So we've got a change of pace here and a change of tone. There's a contrast between the two ways he died, which might make us chuckle when we get to this second sentence there. Then the humor continues with a long, drawn-out, horrible scene with lots of sensory details about the executioner, the beggar, her great-grandfather. And then we have another quick change of pace, change of tone with this conversation between the narrator and her mother. We also see, maybe we smile when we see that her mother just cries out like, "Why do you Americans think of such horrible things?" cried my mother in Chinese, which is what we might also be thinking in that moment. And then all the while, throughout, whether or not you consider this humorous or really morbid, we're getting an idea of a lot of things without the narrator directly stating them. We're getting the idea that there are some cultural differences here between her and her mother. We get some ideas about who our narrator is. Seems like she's pretty cautious. It seems that she's got a very vivid imagination. It seems that she could be pretty morbid. She looks towards the worst possible scenario. We also get an idea of where this story is going. Seems like her mother is going to become some sort of ghost of herself. But none of these things are directly stated. They're just things that the reader can grab from the very beginning of this short story through some inferencing. And the author was able to do that by giving us this family history and this interaction between her and her mother. So perhaps this will give you some ideas if your memoir also contained anything relating to a family's history, cultural differences, or just some things that you were thinking in your head and how that relates to the story. Next, we're going to talk about tension. Tension is the worry, the fear, the anxiety, or the stress that the readers or the characters are facing in a story. I saw students trying to build this a lot while I was going through your memoirs. For example, Caleb, Jesse, or Delvon's stories about a specific sports game, Christian, who broke rule after rule with her friends. Some of you talked about a death in the family or a breakup. Sana and Alexa talked about stories that included starting at a new school. Nisa had a story of recess bullies. There were a lot more, but a lot of you had this moment where you were, or throughout your piece, where you're trying to build a sense of like us kind of waiting for us specific moment of conflict or of a big moment that's going to happen in your memoir. And some of you just wanted to create that tension so that we could feel the relief that you felt at the end of the memoir, which is also great. So we're going to look at some examples of authors who are creating tension, because although some of you attempted to create tension, only a few of you actually achieved it. So by looking at some examples, hopefully you can see how an author can create tension in some models and then use those models to help you fashion it in your own papers. My life changed completely when I was 12, the summer the heavy rains came. The Fen River, which ran through the middle of my family's land, flooded the plains. It destroyed all the wheat my family had planted that year and made the land useless for years to come. Even our house on top of the little hill became unlivable. When we came down from the second story, we saw the floors and furniture were covered with sticky mud. The courtyards were littered with uprooted trees, broken bits of walls, and dead chickens. We were so poor in all this mess. You couldn't go to an insurance company back then and say, "Somebody did this damage, pay me $1 million." In those days, you were unlucky if you had exhausted your own possibilities. My father said we had no choice but to move the family to Wuxi, to the south near Shanghai, where my mother's brother owned a small flour mill. My father explained that the whole family, except for me, would leave immediately. I was 12 years old enough to separate from my family and live with the Huangs. Now this excerpt builds tension in quite a few ways. We've got the external conflict of the flood in the first paragraph here. So by itself, that creates a little stress or anxiety for the reader and definitely for the characters, because we see their house and the entire town getting flooded. We can anticipate another external conflict when we see at the end that she's going to be separated from her family and live with a new one. We can start expecting that something maybe not so good is going to come from her living with another family, and already that's going to start building tension. The author raises the stakes between the two paragraphs. Already the stakes are pretty high when we see that there is a flood and the house has been ruined. But then we see the stakes being raised when the family decides to move without her. It keeps the reader asking questions like, what is going to happen with this family? Why would her family leave her? What is the rest of this story going to be about if she's only 12 and she's forced to live without her family and with maybe strangers? And it creates more than one source of tension, which is a great idea for your own memoirs. In a very short amount of time, we've now got two different sources of tension. The small one of the flood, which ends pretty much right here, and now the one where she is going to be separated from her family. Now, the next two excerpts I chose are from the same story, from the same chapter. So what happens before I start reading this excerpt is she is taken in by this family and treated as a servant. The little boy in this family is promised to her as her husband. And at the time, she is only a teenager when the family decides that she is going to marry this little boy. She hates him. He's a spoiled brat. He cries very easily. She does not want to marry him. The tradition is that on the wedding night, they light a two-sided candle, and if the candle burns from both ends and meets in the middle, then it means that their life is going to be happy for the rest of their days and the marriage is secure. However, if one side goes out or the candles don't meet in the middle before they go out, then it means that their marriage is doomed. So it is her wedding day. She does not want to get married to this horrible person. A lot of bad luck fell on our wedding day, even though the matchmaker had chosen a lucky day, the 15th day of the 8th moon, when the moon is perfectly round and bigger than any other time of the year. But the week before the moon arrived, the Japanese came. They invaded Shanxi province, as well as the provinces bordering us. People were nervous. And the morning of the 15th, on the day of the wedding celebration, it began to rain, a very bad sign. When the thunder and lightning began, people confused it with Japanese bombs and would not leave their houses. I heard later that poor Huang Tai waited many hours for more people to come. And finally, when she could not wring any more guests out of her hands, she decided to start the ceremony. What could she do? She could not change the war. I was at the neighbor's house when they called me to come down and ride the red palanquin, I was sitting at a small dressing table by an open window. I began to cry and thought bitterly about my parents' promise. I wondered why my destiny had been decided, why I should have an unhappy life so someone else could have a happy one. From my seat by the window, I could see the Fen River with its muddy brown waters. I thought about throwing my body into this river that had destroyed my family's happiness. A person has very strange thoughts when it seems that life is about to end. Now here we're able to feel that sense of tension because we are feeling this narrator being tormented. We know that she doesn't want to be there from some earlier paragraphs, but we also just get a sense of it throughout this piece. For example, when she says, I began to cry and thought bitterly about my parents' promise, when her parents promised her to the Huangs to marry their young son, that was the promise that she was helping them fulfill. We see this internal conflict here. Why had my destiny been decided? Why should I be unhappy? We also see an external conflict where she's being forced into a marriage that she does not want to be a part of. We've raised the stakes in this couple of paragraphs. So we saw the flood in the last excerpt. We see that she has to live with this new family, which is by itself a conflict. Now we've got a even higher stakes because she's being forced into marriage, which is supposed to last a lifetime. There's this sense of urgency or time in this part. It is her wedding day, and the clock is just ticking down until the time where she is going to be taken from her dressing table into the ceremony. So that by itself is giving us a sense of stress. And then we have conflicting character goals. Her future mother-in-law, Wang Tai Tai, has the goal of creating the ceremony, getting her son married off. And then meanwhile, she's got the goal of, I don't want to be here. Like, I have to fulfill my promise, but I want to be happy just like everybody else gets a chance here to be happy. So there are many ways that we're building tension before the wedding even begins. And notice how drawn out this is. This is just the moments before she's taken to her ceremony, but she's reflecting on the day's signs, some foreshadowing, which can also create tension. In addition to her feelings about the ceremony, both of those things are creating tension in this piece. Now here we're seeing a scene that involves that double-ended candle that I talked about. After everyone left, we sat there side by side without words for many minutes, still listening to the laughing outside. When it grew quiet, Twang Yu, her now husband, said, "This is my bed. You sleep on the sofa." He threw a pillow and a thin blanket to me. I was so glad. I waited until he fell asleep, and then I got up quietly and went outside, down the stairs, and into the dark courtyard. Outside it smelled as if it would soon rain again. I was crying, walking in my bare feet and feeling the wet heat still inside the bricks. Across the courtyard I could see the matchmaker's servant through a yellow-lit open window. She was sitting at a table looking very sleepy as the red candle burned in its special gold holder. I sat down by a tree to watch my fate being decided for me. I must have fallen asleep because I remember being startled awake by the sound of loud cracking thunder. That's when I saw the matchmaker's servant running from the room, scared as a chicken about to lose its head. Oh, she was asleep too, I thought, and now she thinks it's the Japanese. I laughed. The whole sky became light, and then more thunder came, and she ran out of the courtyard and down the road, going so fast and hard I could see pebbles kicking up behind her. Where does she think she's running to, I wondered, still laughing. And then I saw the red candle flickering just a little with the breeze. I was not thinking when my legs lifted me up and my bare feet ran me across the courtyard to the yellow-lit room. But I was praying to Buddha, the goddess of mercy, and the full moon to make that candle go out. It fluttered a little, and the flame bent down low, but still both ends burned strong. My throat filled with so much hope that it finally burst and blew out my husband's end of that candle. I immediately shivered with fear. I thought a knife would appear and cut me down dead, or the sky would open up and blow me away. But nothing happened, and when my senses came back, I walked back to my room with fast, guilty steps. The next morning, the matchmaker made her proud declaration in front of Tiang Yu, his parents, and myself. "My job is done," she announced, pouring the remaining black ash onto the red cloth. I saw her servant's shame-faced, mournful look. So we can assume as a reader that the servant didn't want to get in trouble for leaving the candle, so she lit it back up and pretended like it burned all the way through the night. Now, this part I especially love as an example of tension because it's a great example of the pace ebbing and flowing, our tension building and then releasing. So here she's with her husband. She's terrified. She doesn't want to be in bed with him. She doesn't love him. She doesn't want to be married to him. But then he says, we're going to sleep in separate places. And she's glad. So the tension there is kind of relieved. Then she goes outside and is crying. So we see a bit of tension again, a bit of torment. Across the courtyard, she's watching this scene unfold. And then we're getting a little bit of a sense of urgency here. So she's watching as this candle is burning down to its ends, and at which time the marriage is going to be considered complete. Then we see the tension building when we see this weather event. All of a sudden we're hearing a crack of thunder. So now again, we're feeling a little bit stressed. And then there's a release of tension, a sense of humor. This woman is running from the Japanese, but if the Japanese are bombing them, then where could she possibly run to? So we see a bit of chuckling. Then again, the tension is building when we see that she goes to the candle herself. Then the tension builds yet more when we get another sense of urgency because she is looking at the candle and deciding whether or not she's going to blow it out. Eventually she does. So here, that ebb and flow is also just continues to create that tension inside of us, whereas just one steady stream of tension might actually start to bore us or seem like something that we don't want to continue reading. So she's giving us a little bit of a reprieve only to build it up again. We get that sense of impending doom. Some of you mentioned with suspense that the weather or the setting can play an important part. So we see that there. That's a great way to build tension. We also have this internal conflict at the end and potentially another sense of impending doom when we see that the servant has tricked the family into believing that the candle has burned down to the edges. So now she's back in this terrible marriage with somebody that she hates. So here we can again anticipate that there's going to be conflict moving forward because she's still stuck back in this marriage. All right, so to summarize, you want to begin your memoir with something unique and memorable. You want to give us an idea of the characters in the situation you will be writing about without directly stating them. What do you want your readers to ultimately know about your personality and values as well as those of other characters? Perhaps create a list of your personality traits that you would like to show in your memoir, as well as those of other characters or what you value. And then see how you can show them instead of tell them throughout your memoir. Dialogue can be a great way to show characterization or change pace. It will be your best friend if you use it correctly. And then if you are looking for a summary of what I was looking for when it came to tension in these stories, there is a 3-minute video on the next slide that will quickly go through all of the parts of tension that you can possibly need to know about for your memoir. More than anything, though, I want you to get the idea that in order to write really well, you need to read a lot. So the more great stories you read from great authors, the more ideas you'll have about different ways to essentially achieve your own goals. If you're trying to create humor, find humorous authors. If you're trying to create suspense, look at authors' works who are known for their suspense. Looking at models is the absolute best way to write better. So I highly recommend, especially if you didn't love Joy Luck Club, although I hope that you did, that you look at books on your own bookshelf or online short stories and books in order to get an idea of how to write your own.